But on the flip side, I think they are fixing a problem that did not exist in Georgia. But it certainly doesn't make Georgia a racist outlier to introduce stricter new ID requirements for absentee ballots, reduce the number of drop boxes where voters can return the ballots, and, for example, reduce hours for early voting. You can say you disagree with all those things, but it's not inconsistent with what a lot of states across the country have. And most importantly, the reduction in hours, it would seem, clearly did not suppress the early votes. So I know it's a lot to ask, but wouldn't it be refreshing to hear folks on CNN or MSNBC who are scaring the heck out of their viewers, or even Stacey Abrams, to say, we disagree with the law, but we're sorry that maybe we overstated it. Now, the part of the Georgia law that always concerned me was the idea that power was being stripped from the voters and election officials on the county and state level and instead being given to partisan legislators. As part of the new law, Georgia created a brand new chairperson to oversee the state's election board. That position was previously held by the Secretary of State. The chairperson is supposed to be a nonpartisan position, but it's filled by the state's, in this case, GOP-controlled legislature. And they appointed Republican Matt Mashburn to the post. Mashburn recently penned a partisan op-ed for the conservative National Review blasting Stacey Abrams. Now, look, whether she deserves it or not, this state election board is now controlled by a seeming partisan figure in Mashburn and his dramatic new power. Most notably, they can suspend election officials in any Georgia county. So if the Republican-led election board wants to suspend an official in heavily Democratic Fulton County, which includes Atlanta, they could do so with no questions asked. What's more, the Secretary of State was actually removed from the state election board altogether, increasing the board's partisan bent. Look, bottom line, the referee shouldn't play for one of the teams. And yet, all of that doesn't really go to suppressing the vote, but to counting it. Making it harder to vote does not necessarily equal voter disenfranchisement. States are allowed to have rules. And that seems to be a distinction which has gone completely unrecognized among many critics on the left. Joining me now is Matt Brown. He's a Georgia-based reporter for The Washington Post. He has been following this election closely. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it. All right, so you've been on the ground there. You've talked to many voters in Georgia. What are they saying about the process?
Right, Dan. I think it's really important to note that, yes, just as you said, anyone who claimed that this voter law was going to make it so that voting would absolutely collapse in Georgia, that turnout just would be incredibly below what we saw in 2018 or 2020 was not correct. And that's what I have been hearing from voters as I've gone out to polling places, both in the metro Atlanta area, but then also all throughout different parts of the state. They've oftentimes expressed that they've said that they've been surprised by how easy in some cases it has been to vote. That said, there have been reports of election misadministration or of poor election administration, the issuing of incorrect ballots or of still issues going on in elections polling sites all across the state, but nothing that would suggest a concerted effort, particularly from this law. I think it's very important to note that this law particularly targeted a lot of early voting and absentee by mail voting, which is something that's been a little bit more difficult for us to parse out at this point in the data on how that has been affected thus far. That's one thing that I'm going to be very interested in looking at as we look to tomorrow.
Now, when you mention election misadministration, you know, that happens in every election, right? There are problems, there are issues that occur with voting. And I always say this when people say, oh, it's fraud, it's fraud. I say, wait. Every election has all sorts of problems and issues that arise. You're not suggesting that that's connected to the new law, right?
No, the particular issues that we've been discussed, actually, it seems that because Georgia, and let's take a step back here and look at just the broader context in this state. This state has the highest voter registration of any state in the country. It was the closest state of any state in the country in the 2020 presidential election. And because of all of that, and because, yes, that this state does have a history of Jim Crow and of voter suppression in its past, the electorate here understands that voting is an important thing to do and that they should be mobilized around it, which means that when people are very willing to report issues of voter issues and that poll workers are more engaged this year, that people are just paying a lot more attention to what is going on here in this state, both nationally, but then also just on the ground level. Like, this is a very, very engaged, vibrant democracy that we have here in Georgia, and with a lot of people with extremely strong opinions about how it should be run on both sides.
So just, again, to go back to the people you're talking to, because I think it's really interesting, because you've been actually doing the reporting on the ground. Are the people who you're talking to, the majority of voters who were afraid, who were scared about what this law could mean, are they surprised? Are they relieved that, oh my goodness, it's not as bad as we were told?
I wouldn't say, I'd say that there were some people who expressed that they were surprised. There's a lot of more people who basically said that because I was so terrified that I wasn't going to be able to vote, I am now going to really read up on everything that I possibly can. I'm going to go out and get the proper identification, and I'm going to show up right on the first day of early voting to make sure that my ballot is absolutely in there. I'm going to be looking at everything possible that could go wrong inside of that polling place to really make sure that my ballot is counted. So I met a lot of people like that who, even after talking with them and said, oh, well, that was a very easy process for you. And they said, yes, but I made sure, because I was very concerned that it wasn't going to go that way, because I'd been told by a lot of people that my vote was not going to be counted.
But again, a lot of the focus from the critics of the law, and you heard me just a moment ago saying that I was a critic of parts of the law in particular, but the people who were sort of making sweeping statements about the law were saying that it was targeting voters based on their race. And yet the numbers, particularly when it comes to early voting, do seem like the number in particular of African-American voters who have already placed their votes in early voting is higher than 2018 or 2020 by far.
Yeah, absolutely. There was no provision in the SB 202, the law down here, that said that Black people can't vote. I think it's important to look at the broader context and show that I think that because this is a state that has such razor thin margins, if you were interested in trying to just change the policies at the margins, that can really shift, the 11,000 vote margin that this state was decided on. And I think that a lot of communities of color, especially, said that they were going to be even more engaged in this. Some, faith leader groups, activist groups like Black Voters Matter and Fair Count, which is a Stacey Abrams founded organization. They particularly said that, after it was clear that this law was going to get passed, that they were going to be able to increase their voter education efforts to work around that.
But that's fair game as far as I'm concerned, right?
Yeah.
My point is, you guys want to change the law? Okay, fine. We're going to galvanize our voters. I get that. But that's different than just whining about how awful. Comparing it to Jim Crow, to me, just seems so over the top when you think about what Jim Crow laws were, and you now look at how, as you just pointed out, Stacey Abrams and others have been able to say, all right, we can live with these rules. We may not like them, but we're going to have to figure out how to best get our people out. And when I say our people, I mean people who support us. And they seem to have succeeded in that, right? Without having to complain that the law is the worst thing that ever happened to America.
Right, and a lot of the criticisms that were levied at the law actually didn't even get passed in the final bill.
Right. For
instance, the ban on souls to the polls or on Sunday voting, as it's more as it's actually policy discussed, that didn't make it into the final law because Georgia businesses behind the scenes, as we reported, really lobbied to bring down a lot of those policies. But that rhetoric continued even after the law was passed. That people were protesting policies that weren't actually in the bill itself.
Yep. All right, Matt Brown, important to have someone like you on the show who's been there on the ground talking to voters, because I think that's a critical piece in this, is what exactly people are saying about what they thought and what they're doing. And as you point out, we've got to wait a little bit longer to see how this all sort of falls. But thanks a lot for taking the time to come on the program. Appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.